The air was poison. Even through the cracked lenses of his mask, Spider-Man could taste the rot in every breath. The hive stretched endlessly above him, towers of corroded steel and soot, vanishing into a sky that hadn't seen sunlight in 10,000 years. The smell of burnt promethium, decay, and despair clung to everything. He awoke not to sirens, nor to screams, but to silence, a silence that felt wrong, the kind that belonged to graveyards, not cities. His web shooters were empty, his suit torn, his body trembling. The last thing he remembered was a blinding flash, a rip through space, a voice that wasn't his whispering through the static of reality. Then darkness. Now, this. He tried to move, but the ground beneath him groaned like a dying beast, metal bones collapsing under centuries of neglect. He had landed in the lower spires of a place the locals called Hive, but this was no New York. The people here didn't look up in hope when they saw a man in a mask. They flinched, they hid, they prayed to something far older and far crueler than justice. From the shadows, hollow eyes stared at him, men and women with skin pale as wax, branded with sigils of labor guilds, their backs bent from decades of servitude. Children coughed black smoke. No laughter, no wonder, only survival. When he reached out a hand, they recoiled as if from a daemon. He whispered, "I'm here to help." But the words meant nothing. Help was a forgotten language in the Imperium of Man. Above, the sirens began to wail. A mechanical voice echoed across the district, distorted and cold. Sector Gamma 7 is under quarantine. Deviants will be purged, by decree of the Emperor. Then the floodlights came, great eyes of white fire scanning the streets. Spider-Man froze, instinct telling him to cling to the walls, to vanish, yet his heart ached. He saw a mother shielding her child beneath the shadow of a crumbling statue, a statue of a rotting god-king, his face half erased by centuries. A group of figures in heavy black armor marched in, carrying shock mauls and bolters, Adeptus Arbites, the enforcers of imperial law. Their footsteps were measured, merciless. One of them raised a loudspeaker. Mutation detected. Unauthorized bioform sighted. Spider-Man realized they meant him. He leapt instinctively, web lines snapping across the metal beam of a hab block, but the air itself felt heavy, as though resisting him. Gravity generators flickered. His swing was clumsy, desperate. Bolter rounds tore through the smog beneath him, bursting like thunder. Shards of metal sliced his side, and the impact sent him crashing through a stained glass window, the glass bearing the sigil of a golden skull crowned with laurels. Inside, he found a church, not one of peace, but of fear. Rows of candles burned in cages. The faithful knelt in silence, their faces covered with iron masks. Every wall was engraved with a single phrase, repeated endlessly. "Suffer, for the Emperor suffers for you." He could barely stand. His wounds bled through the suit. Yet, amid the candles, he saw something he couldn't comprehend, a mural depicting a man crucified upon a starburst throne, his body pierced with golden spears, his eyes weeping light. The locals called him the Emperor of Mankind. Spider-Man's breath trembled. "So, this is your god," he whispered, "and they say I'm the monster." The church doors burst open again. Arbites stormed in. The worshippers didn't scream. They merely bowed lower, whispering prayers as if death itself were holy. He ran. Instinct, again up the pillars, across the rusted rafters, into the vents. His mind raced. There has to be someone to talk to, someone human, someone who still cares. But outside, the streets burned. The Arbites fired indiscriminately. The poor were slaughtered for being poor. And in that moment, Spider-Man understood the cruel symmetry of this world. Justice here wasn't blind. It had been executed long ago. He perched atop a shattered gargoyle, overlooking the endless abyss of the Hive. The city wasn't built upward, it was built downward, layer upon layer of misery sinking toward the planet's molten heart. Millions lived and died here, nameless, unseen. And still, he wanted to help them. He whispered to himself, "If there's even one person left to save, I'll find them." But something deep inside him already knew the truth. In the Hive, there was no salvation, only delay, only decay, only the echo of a promise that had died long before he arrived. From below, the The chanting began again, 1,000 voices crying out in the name of their emperor, while the smoke of burning flesh rose to the ceiling like incense. And Spiderman, the man who once swore to protect every innocent, could only stare down into the darkness and feel the web within his soul begin to tremble. The Hive never slept. Its voice was constant, a low, mechanical hum that rattled through the walls like the heartbeat of a dying god. Every breath Spiderman took was filled with rust and ashes. Every street he crossed was lined with broken statues, carved not from hope, but obedience. Days or maybe weeks passed. Time had no meaning here. The false daylight that bled from the reactor vents above painted everything in shades of sickly yellow. The air shimmered with chemical fumes, and the rain carried acid. But beneath that endless suffocation, there were whispers. They spoke of the God Emperor of mankind, a being so ancient that none living had seen him, yet every soul here swore their lives to his name. The way they spoke, trembling, reverent, afraid, reminded Peter of the way people once whispered about heroes. But this wasn't reverence born of love, it was the worship of terror. He watched a procession of penitents move through the lower levels. Men and women dragging chains behind them, wearing masks of thorns. Their flesh was carved with prayers that bled in rhythmic lines. A preacher, standing atop a mound of corpses, screamed scripture through a rusted speaker. The flesh is weak, the spirit is unworthy, only pain brings purity before the throne. And the people answered, "Pain is salvation." The words echoed through the corridors like metal grinding on bone. Peter felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest. He had fought gods before, men who pretended to be divine, beings who toyed with the fragile faith of humanity. But this was different. Here, divinity wasn't just believed in, it was enforced. Faith had become iron law, and doubt was treason. He hid among them, covered in rags, his once bright suit now a tangle of grime and soot. Sometimes he helped quietly, lifting debris, pulling children from wreckage, stopping the blades of scavengers before they slit another throat. But every act of kindness drew suspicion. They whispered of a shadow with 8 limbs, and priests called it a sign either of the emperor's will or his wrath. One evening, in a derelict chapel, he met an old man who called himself Brother Keeper Jorvan. His eyes were clouded, his hands mechanical. "You shouldn't be here, stranger," the man rasped. "I'm trying to help," Spiderman said. The priest laughed, a sound like metal scraping against stone. "Help? There's no help here, only endurance. We endure until he decides our suffering is enough." Spiderman frowned beneath his mask. "And if he never decides?" Jorvan turned his head, his mechanical spine clicking. "Then we suffer forever. That is faith." The answer crushed something in him. Back home, faith was hope. Faith was believing things could get better. Here, faith was surrender. Faith was submission to pain. He wanted to scream, to shake them, to tell them that the universe didn't need to be like this. But in the shadow of the Imperium, words were nothing. Only silence survived. And yet, somewhere beneath that despair, the people still prayed. They still whispered to their God, asking for mercy that never came. Spiderman wondered, if the Emperor truly existed, did he hear them? Did he care? Or was he, like so many others, just another ghost feeding on their devotion? As the days bled into nights, Spiderman began to sense something strange, a vibration in the Hive's air, like a constant pulse. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could hear it calling, not with words, but through emotion, grief, fear, and the faintest echo of hope. He followed it, leaping from pipe to pipe, deeper into the lower sectors where the light could no longer reach. There, amid the filth and forgotten bodies, he found an altar. It was made not of gold, but of bone and wire. Skulls were fused into the machine's surface, their mouths still whispering scraps of prayer. And in the center a hologram flickered weakly. A man on a throne, unmoving, eyes glowing faintly. The image trembled as if alive, repeating the same phrase in endless loops. "Serve the Emperor, suffer in his name." Peter stared. The words echoed around him, each repetition heavier than the last. He whispered, almost to himself, "Back home, I believed in responsibility, in saving those who couldn't save themselves. Here, they call that heresy." He clenched his fists, the web shooters sparking with faint light. If this Emperor is so great, then why does he need them to suffer? The machine's eyes flared suddenly, as if responding. A voice, not mechanical, but ancient, crawled through the static. Because pain is the price of order. Peter stumbled back, heart pounding. The hologram flickered violently, then vanished, leaving only silence. He stood there for a long time, the smell of burning oil thick in his lungs, and in that silence, he felt something shift inside him, a realization that this world didn't need another savior. It needed a rebellion. But he was one man, one broken man, in a place that devoured hope for fuel. And somewhere, far below, in the churning guts of the Hive, he could already sense something stirring, something hungry. For the first time since his arrival, Spider-Man felt fear not for himself, but for the billions who still prayed to a throne that would never answer. He looked up through the choking smog, toward the endless towers above, and whispered, "If there's a God here, he's not listening." He didn't mean to start a war, but in the Imperium of Man, even compassion was treason. It began with a scream. A child no older than 10 dragged from a shelter by the Arbites. The enforcers accused her of harboring mutation. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, the faintest trace of bioluminescent dust from the Hive's polluted air. That was enough for them to call her unclean. Spiderman intervened. He didn't think he acted, like he always had. The web shot forward, catching the maul before it struck. The force of the impact reverberated up his arm. In the gloom, the Arbites turned their visored heads toward him, lenses glowing crimson. Unauthorized bioform detected. Purge protocol initiated. They didn't see a hero. They saw an infection. Bolter fire erupted heavy, thunderous, each shot a miniature explosion that tore through walls and flesh alike. Spider-Man moved faster than any human eye could follow, darting between pillars, using shattered machinery as cover. His webs hissed through the toxic air, snagging weapons, disarming soldiers, but even as he fought, he realized something dreadful. These men didn't fear him. They didn't feel anything at all. When one Arbite fell, another took his place, moving in perfect, mechanical unison. Their voices echoed the same litany through their helmet speakers. The Emperor protects. The Emperor purifies. There was no mercy in their tone, only algorithmic certainty. He fought with restraint, as he always had. He pulled blows, disarmed instead of killing. But here, restraint was weakness. For every enforcer he disarmed, 2 more came. And when they fell, others burned their bodies to prevent corruption. Spider-Man's heart pounded with anger and disbelief. He had seen tyranny before, but never one that called itself holy. When the battle was over, the child was gone. Taken by the Arbites transports, swallowed by the upper tiers. The street burned. Civilians hid behind metal doors, whispering prayers instead of thanks. He stood there, trembling, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and oil. And from the speakers high above, a voice spoke cold and absolute. Deviant bioform recorded. Code designation, Arachnid 666. Heresy confirmed. Execution authorized. From that moment on, he became the hunted. The Hive turned against him. Servitors' flesh fused with steel patrolled the tunnels, their eyes scanning for the spider thing. Surveillance cherubs floated through the corridors, their infant faces smiling mindlessly as they whispered prayers into vox feeds. Even the walls seemed to watch. He couldn't rest. He couldn't think. Every hour brought more patrols, more drones, more screams. The Imperium's justice was absolute not because it was right, but because it was endless. And yet, amid the chaos, he began to see patterns. Every enforcer, every servitor, every purity seal carried a similar mark, a cog within a skull, the Adeptus Mechanicus. It wasn't just faith that kept this place alive, it was the machine god. He followed the mark, deeper into the Hive's industrial heart, where heat shimmered and the air screamed with the sound of turbines. There, he saw things that defied reason. Men without faces, their heads replaced by lenses, women whose arms had been replaced by steel limbs that never stopped turning, rows of infants connected to cogitator cores their minds used as processors. The machine priests walked among them, chanting binary hymns, their voices a harmony of human and code. The flesh is fallible, the circuit is pure. Spider-Man felt something inside him shatter. These weren't monsters. They were believers, zealots who had traded humanity for efficiency. He approached one, a figure draped in red robes, a dozen servo arms twitching behind its back. "Why?" Spider-Man asked, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Why turn people into machines?" The priest turned, its voice a blend of vox and whisper. "To remove weakness, to preserve the divine order. The flesh lies, the machine endures." Peter clenched his fists. "You call that divine?" The priest tilted its head. "You speak as if mercy is strength, but mercy rusts. It corrodes the will. Your compassion is a flaw, and flaws must be purified." Then, with inhuman speed, the priest signaled the servitors. Wires whipped forward like tendrils. Spider-Man dodged, but the impact tore his shoulder open. Pain shot through his nerves like fire. He retaliated with webs, yanking the priest's servo arm free. Sparks exploded in the dark, lighting the chamber like a forge of hell. The priest didn't scream. It only recited scripture as its body burned. Glory to the Omnissiah. Glory through annihilation. When the fight was over, he stood surrounded by the wreckage-torn machinery, burning oil, the stench of metal and blood. He felt no victory, only sickness. He looked at his trembling hands, slick with grease and blood. His reflection stared back at him in the melted steel, a man who no longer recognized his own eyes. Once, he believed his powers were a gift, a responsibility. Now, they were a curse, a spark of mutation that damned him in the eyes of an empire built on fear. He whispered softly to the void, "Maybe they're right. Maybe mercy doesn't belong here." Above him, the great engines of the Hive roared louder, as if answering. The city moved, alive and blind, feeding on itself, a mechanical god consuming its own worshippers. And somewhere, deep within its iron veins, Spider-Man began to feel the first threads of something vast tightening around him, not a web of silk, but a web of fate. He dropped out of the law's searchlight and into the city's forgotten lung. Down here, light didn't travel, it drowned. The underlevels coughed, up a viscous dusk made of oil mist and boiled rot. Air turned to tar between the teeth. He landed on a catwalk that had outlived its builders, a spine of rivets and prayer tags swaying over a lake of sump that glistened like a dead galaxy. Every ripple carried the reflected glow of warning runes, red, amber, the colors of old wounds. He moved in silence, letting the Hive's own heartbeat mask his footfalls. Pistons thumped like distant artillery, vents breathed feverish heat. Cogitator stacks clicked and muttered litanies of self-repair. Somewhere deeper, a siren wailed and kept wailing, as if the city were mourning itself and could not stop. They watched him long before they spoke. Eyes nested in the metal children's eyes, hollow as spent cartridges. Men with pilgrim shackles still fused to bone. Women with respirators held together by saint wire and stubbornness. A dozen small shadows inched along the railings, knife points ready, hunger sharper. He raised his hands, empty. The gesture meant nothing here. An empty hand only proved you had nothing worth taking. He reached into a broken feeder and tugged free a clotted filter brick, coughed black, then webbed a rag around a leaking steam seam to staunch the scald. A child flinched at the sound. A woman stopped her from running. The webbing steamed and held. The hiss lowered from rage to sulk. "Spider," the woman rasped through rubber valves. "Machine's witchcraft." "Just glue," he answered, "and bad decisions." A few of the knives lowered. They called this place the Rattle, where the spire's bones shook in the night, where pipes sang of collapses still to come. Here, the forgotten survived by repurposing the corpse of civilization. Doors became diet, circuit boards ground into flavor over corpse starch gruel, hymnals torn for kindling. He found a hovel nested under a collapsed bridge, a canopy of cargo net, a shrine made from a cracked data slate, and a tooth that might have been human. He slept there for an hour that felt like a century. When he woke, they were closer. The woman with the respirator, called Mera by those who needed to call her something, studied him with an accountant's cold. Two boys stood like punctuation at her shoulders, scavenged shock prods flickering. In the dim, their ribs wrote unreadable ciphers beneath their skin. "You're the deviant," she said. "No judgment, an inventory term." "I'm trying not to be," he said. "You fought the Black Hoods," one boy added. Heard it on the Vox. They said you bent iron like taffy and took bullets like a saint. I prefer taffy to sainthood, he murmured. Less paperwork. No one laughed. Even humor rusted down here. He helped where he could. The first salvaged mercy was simple, a web stitch through a child's split scalp, the adhesive sealing around bone without poison. The second was heavier. A falling hazard crane, half alive, half malicious, sheared a walkway. He shot a lattice of filaments into the darkness, turned collapse into trap, and lowered a dozen bodies to safety. The third was a theft. He crawled, ant-like, through a ventilation vein and robbed a ration printer of its jammed nutrient drum, rolling it back with squealing bearings while the rattle's children marched behind him, solemn, as if he were towing a planet. Little by little they named him, because naming is the first rebellion against fear. Not hero, that word had been exiled to fairy tales and treason. Not deviant, that belonged to the loudspeakers. They called him web ghost, wall saint, thread thief. The names meant hope without saying it aloud. At night, he listened to Mira's ledger of losses spoken like prayers. 8 gone to sump fever, 2 taken by hoods for tithes, 1 sold himself to a machine for clean lungs, came back with none of himself left. She never cried. The city had dehydrated grief into grit. He asked finally, "Why stay?" "Where to?" she said, tilting her head toward the ceiling, toward continents of rock and gunfire. "Up there we die slow. Down here we die knowing each other's names. It is not worse." He closed his eyes. In a kinder universe, that would have been a punchline to a bad day. In this one, it was a philosophy. The rattle tested him. A pack of sump ghouls, men shaved of humanity until only appetite remained, raided their stores with bone hooks and laughter like broken glass. He met them at the catwalk's throat. His webs sang tight, lines strung between pylons, turning the corridor into an instrument of refusal. He moved like refusal, sharp, exact, unamused. He left them alive. The rattle stared as if this was obscenity. "You let them breathe," Mira said, not as accusation but uncomprehending fact. "If we all stop deciding not to kill," he said, "there's nothing left to resurrect." Resurrection. She tasted the unfamiliar word. "Is that a machine god thing, or one of your old world jokes?" "Both," he said, "and neither." For a few days, if these tremulous intervals could be called days, the rattle breathed easier. The sump tasted less like punishment. Children drew lopsided spiders on rust with soot. He retensioned gangways with webbing that hardened into glassy ropes. He rerouted a trickle of hot air from a preacher's dead chapel to Mira's ward of coffers. It cost no one anything but the chapel's silence. That was the sin that mattered. The first warning arrived as a smell. Sanctified ozone. Like lightning that paid tithes. The second as a sound. Hymn drones. Cherub skulls cooing binary lullabies. The third as language. Stamped sigils of rosette and wax on the chests of men who wore law like a sacrament and suspicion like perfume. Inquisition. They did not storm. Storms have mercy in their chaos. They arrived with choreography. 3 cadres, 1 to kneel and sample the air with sensor lackeys. 1 to separate the crowd into geometry, lines, stacks, cul-de-sacs. 1 to walk softly and look at everything as if it had already confessed. The inquisitorial interrogator at their head wore no helmet. The Hive's poison respected him the way a whip respects its owner. His eyes were lightless. Not cruel. Cruelty implies appetite. He had been emptied of appetite and replaced with mandate. "Arachnid entity," he said, as if reciting a weather report. "Present yourself for divination and dissection." The rattle held its breath until the sump forgot to ripple. Spiderman stepped forward. Not into the circle. They drew a geometry of obedience painted in chalks of sanctified ash, but onto the rail above it. The higher place gave him nothing but air, but it felt like a line he could draw with his own body. "People are choking," he said. "Let me fix vents, seal fevers, you can test me after." "Mercy is a mutation," the interrogator replied without heat. "You will come down." Webs whispered outward, kissing walls, threads sleeking to anchor points opposite their lines. He held his palms open again. The gesture still meant nothing, but he forced it to mean something because that was what he had left. The Inquisition made its first move. Not bolter, not blade, a scripture. A servo scribe trudged forward and read, A litany enumerating the 100 forms of deceit used by daemons assuming pleasing shapes. It mentioned masks. It mentioned webs. It mentioned the compulsion to save as a temptation to be purged. The crowd began to tremble, not because the words convinced them, but because words here were tools the way knives are tools. Every syllable shaved away an argument he hadn't made yet. Peter, Mera whispered, using a name he had never spoken aloud. He didn't flinch. Perhaps he had said it while dreaming. Perhaps the walls listened better than friends. Run. He tasted the word run like a sacrament, and spat it out. Test me then, he said to the interrogator. But test me with your hands, not their throats. He motioned to the children, to the coffers, to the ledger that had learned to walk. I'm not chaos. I'm not your machine's ghost. I'm just wrong, the interrogator said, almost gently. You are an anomaly. Anomalies are cross-referenced, vivisected, archived, and forgotten. This preserves order. Order, Peter repeated, and something in him laughed without joy. That word's been working very hard. The interrogator gestured. Cherubs unfurled wings of parchment and copper. Micro-syringes glittered like frost. The crowd drew backward exactly 1 pace. They knew that distance. It was the length of complicity. He moved first, because webs mean initiative. A burst of lines not to bind throats but barrels, not to break bones but trajectories. Bolters coughed in confused chords. Hymn drones spun into sticky cocoons, their lullabies muffled to suffocation. He dropped from the rail, twisted, caught the interrogator's wrist as the rosette glowed and spat a field of shimmering hex around him. Pain leapt up his forearm like an animal and bit, but he had been bitten before by worse things than light. They fought without rage. It was stranger than any battle he'd known, 2 functions trying to rewrite each other. The rosette hummed counter-frequencies. His webs drew new geometry over old litany. The floor remembered ancient tremors and contributed 1 more. A portion of the ceiling decided the present was the right time to become the past and fell. He dragged Mera and 3 children through a slot that insisted it was not a door until webbing convinced it. Then the rattle screamed. Not people metal. An artillery transport above had vomited a payload into the wrong birth canal. The shock traveled down the spire, broke 3 valves, snapped a heat vein. Scalding steam rolled like a white beast through the underlevels. It met flesh and taught it new languages of agony. He could have fled into the vents, sealed himself in the arteries he knew now like an anatomy chart. Instead, he went toward the milk-white roar. His webs hardened into shields that warped and sagged and failed, and were replaced by more. He wrapped bodies, cocooned lungs, carved corridors through fog. His suit blistered and hissed. His skin learned the meaning of refinery. Through the burn, he saw the interrogator across the ruin. The man stood within his hex halo, untouched, as if immune to consequence. Their eyes locked. You cannot save them all, the Inquisitor said. It wasn't taunt, it was a transcription of law. I know, Peter said, hauling 2 more toward air that barely deserved the noun. I only promised to try. The steam thinned. Screams wound down to sobbing and the clink of teeth against respirators. The rattle had been mauled but not devoured. He had lost count of what he had done right and what he had merely failed to do wrong. The Inquisition withdrew like tide not defeated, only rescheduled. The interrogator's last look was a ledger line drawn clean, further study required. Night arrived, or what the Hive called night when the upper reactors dimmed to a bruise. Mera sat beside him on the catwalk edge, legs dangling over the city's throat. Children slept stacked like sentry stones, each breathing the other's warmth. He wrapped an extra skein of webbing under a boiler seam that moaned threats in its sleep. You're not a saint, Mera said finally. No, he answered, staring into the sump's deceitful stars. Saints have biographies. What are you then? A reminder, he said. He didn't know for whom, maybe for himself, maybe for a god that had stopped reading reminders a long time ago. She touched her respirator, then the web seam over the vent, his small theft from the chapel. They'll come back. I know. They'll bring a bigger god. He closed his eyes. In the absolute dark behind the lids, his mind drew lines. Between faces and outcomes, between mercy and arithmetic, between the city's craving for order and his refusal to call starvation orderly. Every line trembled, every line held for now. "Then I'll bring more thread," he said softly. And far below, in the hive's bowel where prayers and waste shared the same pipes, something answered with a rumble like hunger learning a new word. He didn't sleep after that night. Not truly. The hive had a way of whispering even when it was silent, metal murmuring in its dreams, vents sighing with phantom breath. The city was never still, and neither was he. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard them again. The screams of those he couldn't save, the hiss of steam cutting through flesh, the hollow voice of the Inquisitor saying, "You cannot save them all." He began to wonder if the man had been right. Mira watched him from afar. The others, the Rattle's children, the broken, the hopeless, still believed in their web ghost. They offered him scavenged icons painted in soot and blood, crude spiders with halos, etched into the walls beside shrines of the Emperor. They whispered his name in the same breath as prayers. It terrified him. He wasn't a god. And he was beginning to suspect that in this world, gods were the cruelest monsters of all. It happened 3 nights later. The hive trembled again, but this time, not from machines or war above. Something deeper was stirring. A procession moved through the underlevels. Torches burning blue, banners made of flayed skin fluttering in the recycled wind. Their armor was etched with sigils of authority, their steps precise as scripture. The Inquisition had returned. At their center walked the same interrogator. His cloak bore scorch marks from the last encounter, but his eyes black, hollow, tireless, burned with the same quiet certainty. Beside him moved a figure in crimson robes, adorned with mechanical limbs that clicked and folded like insects. A tech priest of Mars. The entity known as Arachnid 666, the priest intoned, voice harmonized between flesh and code. Its anatomy exhibits both organic and warp-reactive anomalies. Permission to retrieve for sanctified study. Granted, the Inquisitor said simply. Spiderman crouched high above, clinging to rusted girders. His body trembled, not from fear but exhaustion. He had fought monsters, men, and gods. But this was something else. Bureaucracy with divine permission. A machine that had learned to speak scripture. He could feel the Rattle's people below, holding their breath. Mera stood at the front, clutching a jagged blade made from broken servitor plating. Behind her, the children clung to each other, their small eyes reflecting the torchlight like dying stars. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to leap down and end it before it began. But the moment his muscles tensed, something else stopped him. A sound. A whisper. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, inside his skull, inside the walls, inside the hive itself. You could save them, if you let go. He froze. The voice was not the Emperor's. It was not human. It vibrated through his veins like a song from the warp, distant, seductive, patient. You cling to weakness, to compassion, to a morality that this galaxy buried millennia ago. Let it die, Peter. He shook his head, gripping the beam until metal dented under his fingers. No. You can't save them like this. You can't save anyone while chained to guilt. Below, the Inquisitor's men began dragging the first civilians from their homes. A child screamed. Mira shouted, charging forward. Bolter fire answered. Something inside him snapped. He didn't remember leaping, only the sound of air splitting around him. Web lines shot out in a blur of silver, catching soldiers by the neck, slamming them into walls. His landing cracked the ferrocrete floor. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, chaos. He moved like vengeance, given flesh. The Inquisition fired. He dodged. Blades swung. He countered. Each movement was perfect but joyless. His restraint, once sacred, had withered. He no longer thought of non-lethal. He only thought of stopping. The tech priest advanced, chanting binary curses. Mutation confirmed. Holy cleansing required. Its servo arms unfolded like a spider made of bone and brass. It lunged, saws screeching. Spiderman caught one mid-swing. Twisting metal shrieked. Sparks showered. His other hand tore the respirator cables from the priest's throat. Steam hissed from the wound, carrying the stench of burning oil and sanctified blood. The priest convulsed, mechanical limbs spasming, before collapsing in a heap of sparks and prayer ashes. The Inquisitor did not move. He simply raised his rosette, The sigil of his rank flared to life, burning with warplight. "By the Emperor's will," he said softly, "you are absolved through death." The light struck him like a hammer. Pain, unlike any he had ever known, tore through him, not physical, but spiritual. It felt as if every guilt, every failure, every corpse he'd ever failed to save had been ripped open and shown to him at once. He screamed. The webbing turned red, his vision blurred, and through it all, the whisper returned. "Let it go. You can't fight divinity, but you can become something greater." He fell to one knee, breath ragged, blood boiling with unseen energy. The warp brushed against his soul like a hand offering mercy or corruption. He looked up at the Inquisitor, whose expression remained almost sorrowful. "Why?" Spider-Man gasped. "Why kill what could save you?" The man answered simply, "Because faith is not salvation, it is obedience." And then he fired. The bolt round struck him square in the chest. The impact sent him through the steel wall, down into the depths below, into the black heart of the Hive, where light never reached and gods stopped listening. He didn't die. The web caught him before the fall finished. But it was not his web. It was made of something older, something alive. It pulsed like veins under starlight. When he touched it, visions flooded his mind, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 voices, 1,000 screams that weren't his but could have been. He saw himself reflected in them, not as Peter Parker, not as Spider-Man, but as something else, a creature strung between light and shadow, between compassion and wrath. He felt the warp watching him, waiting. And for the first time since his arrival, he did not whisper no. Above, Mira and the others fled into the burning tunnels. The Inquisitor ordered the Hive sealed. Containment complete, a servitor confirmed. But deep below, amid the tangle of living web and metal veins, a new heartbeat began to echo, steady, strong, defiant. A hero had fallen. Something else was rising. Dawn did not come to the Hive. What arrived instead was a sky of teeth. The first spores fell like a false rain, green-black pearls trailing threads of fire. They struck the upper spires with the thud of rotten fruit and burst into flowering nightmares, chitin blossoming, bone extruding, sinew knitting itself with insect patience and murder's urgency. Vox-hailers switched from decrees to litanies, then to static, then to screams. Above the rattle, a cathedral gantry sheared like brittle bread. The city swallowed its own architects. He felt it in the metal before he saw it in the streets, the way the Hive flinched. Turbines hiccuped, power grids coughed. The floor under his palms learned the mathematics of panic. Spider-Man stood at the edge of the sump lake and watched the reflection of a new ecosystem germinate. Spore chimneys extruding, capillary towers drilling into ferrocrete, a forest with one prayer consume. He moved, not toward safety. There was none. He moved toward the noise. The first wave were the small ones, 1,000 knives with legs, clicking, churring, laughing in the high language of hunger. They swarmed over slag heaps and along the rails, pinwheeling across walls as if gravity were a negotiable habit. His webs sang into geometry, fans, nets, spirals, sheets. He pinned them, stacked them, hurled them back into their own teeth. Their bodies melted where his webbing met their acids, a hiss, a sizzle, a little smoke. New ones climbed over the corpses of the old without pathos. He had fought crowds. This was not a crowd. This was appetite. Civilians poured from sluice doors, blind with terror and the confidence of the doomed. He ran the corridor of triage he had been building in his head since he woke here. Choke point 1, web bridge 2, vent 3, heating vein 4. It was not a plan that saved everyone. It was a plan that let more than no one live. "Through," he barked, voice shredded to command. "Don't stop, don't look, breathe when I say." He sealed a seam with a sheet of filament, punched a fist through a rust belly to vent heat down and toxins up. A child tripped. He didn't see which one. He only saw small hands fail at physics and made a rope of himself to defy it. Bodies flowed past like sentence fragments. He stapled them into a paragraph that meant survival for another 5 minutes. Then the shadows learned his name. The lictor came like a memory of being prey. The air cooled around it with the temperature of knowing. It slid down a wall as if walls wished to obey it, plume quivering, scythe arms tasting the space where he stood before he'd chosen to stand there. He didn't think. Thought was a room with doors. It would open none fast enough. He moved as he had moved under 1,000 rooftops, where falling meant headlines and regrets. But here, falling meant fertilizer. The first scythe cut a hair's width from his throat. He let it think it had him and returned a web through its gill slits, double anchor, 2-point draw, torque. Bone squealed. It shed the line like old skin. The second scythe fell, and he caught it at the elbow, knew there was no elbow, only intention, and broke that instead. The creature hissed a language that had never needed verbs. He webbed its mouth because silence felt like a victory someone could count, and then he dragged it bodily through a vent, grate into steam so hot the chitin blistered and shrieked. It did not die. It learned him and left. In the seconds between waves, he listened to his own heart try to outpace physics. He heard Mera's voice through a veil of alarms. North Gantry, they're flanking. Wall Saint, your bridge. He ran the way men run on names they did not choose. He arrived at the gantry to find 3 children attempting to carry a fourth as if friendship could be a stretcher. His web hardened under their feet into something like faith. Only then did he see the acid line scoring its slow alphabet across the cable above them. He threw a line, became a counterweight, learned the exact weight of 4 children and 1 promise. Behind him, the rattle caught fire. Not a romantic fire, a refinery fire, teaching air what it can be when it hates. He pulled a dozen into an alcove, sealed the entrance with a membrane that thought it was a lung, and took a breath he did not deserve to keep. Over the din, a preacher somewhere sang to the Emperor with the clarity of a man who believes he has already been answered. He went back out. A larger shadow broke the corridor's spine. It was not a beast, not a soldier, a verdict. Plates like ship hulls, head like a siege writ, bioplasma simmering in a throat that had learned architecture as a food group. It punched through a column that had survived 5 dynasties and declared the present day its extinction. He could not stop it, he could only redirect it. "Here," he shouted, and the thing listened without comprehension. He threw lines, dozens, into its joints, found purchase on bone hooks and gristle rings. He ran, and in running, he tethered it to the hive's own sins, cranes abandoned mid-lift, coils of chain that remembered cruel assignments, a monorail ribcage that had not forgotten how to cradle weight. He tricked the city into defending itself. The beast plowed forward, tore free, plowed again, snagged, howled with a noise that asked the world for fewer rules. Mera appeared at his flank, not with a prayer or a plan, but with a torch cannibalized from a promethium leak and absolute contempt for extinction. She jammed the torch into the thing's eye because there are anatomies that answer to fire when they answer to nothing else. It answered. Spiderman's webs collided into a dome above the eye, trapping the flame where the scream originated. The carnifex, if that was the word, slammed backward into a tower. The tower decided it had been a tower long enough and toppled. For a few seconds, the rattle knew a quiet that felt like the inside of a closed book. He wanted to laugh, and could not remember how. The vox crackled with the voice of order. All non-essential sectors, purge by fire. All faith cores, sing louder. Somewhere above, the Arbites decided that losing to monsters was an offense punishable by artillery. Mortars began to explain themselves to the lower levels. Concrete became opinionated. Rails turned to shrapnel. The air played music in a key called shiver. He carved corridors where there had been none. Doors admitted new careers as walls. Walls accepted demotion. His webs set, sagged, and set again, improvisation baked into glass. For each life threaded through the maze, 2 were cut elsewhere. His count failed. He stopped counting. Compassion did not scale. It still had to be performed. In the pause that wasn't, the lictor returned, bringing cousins. He did not outfight them. He outdrew them, lattices flung low to make speed a liability, high to make leaps confess gravity, tight to make scythes confess leverage. Teeth found his left calf anyway. Claws asked his ribs if they would prefer to be outside. He answered with a web line jammed point-blank into a throat, charges firing until acetone tears skittered off the carapace. He remembered to breathe only, because pain insisted. He fell back to a mezzanine halfway to nowhere. Mera dragged 3 small bodies past him with the assurance of someone who had long ago divorced hope from effort. Up, she said, as if up were a place. Up, he agreed, because agreement is a kind of fuel, and they were running out of all the others. The mezzanine shook. A spore pod hammered through the roof, cracked open like a sermon ending, and spilled something lithe and laughing. He met it without ceremony, threw one line, then another, then trusted the brittle railing with more of his faith than it deserved. The railing gave way in exactly the measure required to throw the beast off balance. The fall wrote its own epitaph on rebar below. The city screamed again. This time the sound was not coming from throats but from systems, a machine wail as cogitators discovered their own mortality. Power shuddered. The light went the color of last rites. The last of the evacuees stumbled through the membrane toward the sump docks, where boats meant sheets of plastic she could convince to float. He looked up. For a moment he saw the Hive as the Hive saw itself, a body whose organs had learned not to love each other, a mind that had outsourced ethics to statute, a soul that survived by ritualizing grief. He was not its cure. He was a fever that tried to burn a bigger fever. Something hit him. He did not see it. He heard the world tilt, felt the floor become a stranger, tasted blood that had an opinion about iron. He found his feet because there was nothing else left to find. His mask hung by a rendition of a prayer. He pressed it back. It pressed back poorly. Across the wreck, the Inquisitor appeared as if conjured by arithmetic rosette, dim, eyes exact. Around him, a cordon of arbites fired in neat failings at things too numerous to dignify with aim. The man looked at Spiderman not like a foe, but like the last unsolved notation on a page that had to be submitted by end of day. "This is containment," he said, voice achievable even here. "You are a breach." Spiderman wanted to answer with a manifesto. He had only breath. He spent it. "They're dying." "They were always dying," the man said. "Today, they do it for a reason." "Your reason," Mera hissed from behind a pipe. The Inquisitor did not turn. Reasons do not turn when facts speak. A shadow rose behind the Inquisitor, not tyrannid. Human, a gene-stealer curate in rags, eyes full of family that had never been. It leapt with the grace of a forgiveness he would have denied. Spiderman moved before, thought requested permission, webline, yank, redirect. The creature smashed into a broken saint's alcove and learned martyrdom. The Inquisitor did not thank him. He did not need to. The ledger acquired a new column titled, "Not Immediately Detrimental." Then the ceiling surrendered. A beam came down like an argument. Spiderman took Mera into his arms without ceremony and hurled a net that wished to be an arch. It held, trembled, failed, and held anyway, because sometimes structure is will alone. The beam skimmed his shoulder and taught bone humility. His mask split across an eye. The world doubled and kept going. "Go," he told Mera, and hated himself for how cliché it sounded, as if words could be new when the world was this old. "Lead them. I'll buy time," she said, as if reading a tax form. Then softer, "Peter." He flinched. Names are knives when they are true. "Go." She went. The children followed her into a corridor he had bribed into being. He watched until their silhouettes became grammar, then became rumor, then became an ache with feet. The lictor returned, because hunger is patient when it has eternity on retainer. He stood in the opening of the corridor and made his body larger than it was with threads and lies. It came like a whisper you agree to hear. He met it with a webcast that split into 100 sub-threads mid-flight, a snowfall of silk that choked vents and snared scythes and turned stealth into noise. He took the strike meant for his throat on his forearm. Something in the arm remembered an old bridge in Queens and refused to break, just out of sentiment. Bolter fire stitched the air around them. The Arbites were shooting at everything, not them. Sometimes they were them. He dragged the lictor into the path of a shell that introduced itself in a hurry. The creature folded around the explosion like a closing hand and was quiet. He exhaled the part of himself that still believed in calculus. For a moment, the corridor held. The world decided not to end in that second out of sheer contrariness. Then the big one came back, the verdict, with legs half buried, half angry, all momentum. There was no redirect left. He did not calculate. He offered himself as algebra, x equals delay. He shot both web shooters dry in a single breath, lines knotting to beams, pillars, dead saints, live pipes, a tapestry of refusal. The beast hit it, and the world followed. He moved where the impact would make a man no longer a man, and let it make him something else. A bruise with intent. When he woke seconds, years he could not hear. The Hive had put its hands over his ears. The mask was gone, or he was gone, and the mask remained. He felt cold metal against his cheek, smelled incense that had never met holiness, and saw a silhouette bent over him like a surgeon's idea of mercy. A tech priest, not the one he had killed, a kinder ruin. Glyphs glowed on mechadendrites like reluctant stars. Specimen exhibits resilience of interest, it murmured, voice a duet of pity and procurement. Flesh is compromised, function salvageable, recommend integration. He tried to move and succeeded at pain. The priest's limbs unfolded with the choreography of spiders and operating theaters. Do not fear. The weak is excised. The useful is sanctified. He laughed, a dry, cracking sound, because the city had finally offered him an honest sentence. Do it, he whispered, not to the priest, not to the Inquisition, not even to himself, but to the thread that bound all this failure together. Do it, and make it buy them one more hour. The world dimmed to a red the Hive considered merciful. Drills kissed bone with liturgical care. Somewhere, Mera herded children through a hole that used to be a law. Somewhere, the Tyranids learned a new street and forgot an old one. Somewhere, the Emperor either listened or did not. Here, under a tower that had run out of prayers, a hero bled into a machine and called it a compromise. He awoke to the smell of sanctified oil. Not the kind used in prayer, but the one that burned, the kind that corroded bone while whispering scripture. The world around him pulsed with red light, heartless and rhythmic, like the city itself had learned how to breathe without lungs. He was on a slab. Chains coiled over his arms and chest, not to restrain but to measure. Each link hummed faintly, counting pulses, cross-referencing oxygen, comparing sin to efficiency. The walls were covered in purity seals, hundreds of them, paper-thin prayers stapled into iron, fluttering like dying moths as machinery sang hymns in code. "Flesh is an error," said a voice beside him. "We correct errors." The tech priest stood over him, not the one he had slain, but another, older, more tranquil. Its face was a nest of bronze tendrils, its mouth long replaced by a vox emitter that rasped like sand across a tombstone. Its eyes, three of them, turned in mechanical rhythm, studying him as a specimen, not as a soul. Subject retains unique regenerative parameters. DNA strands contain foreign coding, non-human origin. It paused. Designation confirmed. Arachnid 666, Priority Omega, approved for sanctified integration. He tried to move, but his body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy, his breath uneven. Pain wasn't sharp, it was total. He looked down and saw that part of his chest was no longer his. A lattice of machinery had replaced the shattered ribs. Threads of metal and glowing filaments stitched directly into his muscle fibers, glowing faintly like veins filled with starlight. The tech priest moved a servo arm across his heart, tracing the outlines of mechanical grafts while whispering a binary prayer. "The Omnissiah does not waste. You will serve his purpose." He coughed, blood spilling dark and slow. "Serve? You mutilated me." The priest turned, head cocking slightly. "No, we refined you. You are closer to the divine now, half flesh, half order." He wanted to scream, to tear the machine apart with his bare hands. But his hands didn't respond. The left one trembled, then clicked. A sound like silk tearing came from beneath his palm. Threads metallic, impossibly fine, burst out, weaving across the slab, glinting under the crimson light. He froze. His web was no longer silk. It was metal. Living metal. The priest's voice sharpened. "The integration proceeds. The neural lattice accepts both code and instinct, a rare union of mutation and mechanism." Peter turned his head away. The movement triggered a cascade of pain that swallowed his vision whole. When it cleared, he saw his reflection in a fractured cogitator screen. Half of his face was still human, bloodied, exhausted, terrified. The other half was mask and scar and wire. A hollow red lens glowed where his right eye had been. He wanted to vomit. Instead, he laughed. It came out broken, metallic. "Congratulations," he rasped. "You built your first monster." The tech priest didn't answer. Machines rarely argue with truths. Days or hours, or eternities passed. He could no longer tell the difference. The Hive's reactors groaned above him like ancient gods shifting in their sleep. Between each wave of consciousness, he heard the binary hymns the priests chanting to their machine god, as though he could hear them through rust and blood. Sometimes he dreamed. He saw the web vast, infinite, stretching across galaxies. Each strand pulsed with light, billions of souls, each one connected, each one struggling, screaming, burning. He saw the Imperium's towers collapsing, the stars themselves flickering like dying embers. And at the center, a great silence, something that watched but never spoke. When he woke, his body obeyed differently. He could feel the hum of the Hive's machinery, its energy coursing through the filaments buried in his flesh. He could hear things now, the magnetic pull of turbines, the song of servo engines in the distance, the faint tremor of Mera's voice echoing through a vent far above him. She was alive. That thought alone stopped him from letting the darkness win. The priest returned with attendants half human, half tool, their minds long since edited for obedience. One of them whispered, "The Imperium requires another soldier." Another murmured, "The flesh repents through metal." He said nothing. He waited. When they released him from the slab, his legs nearly collapsed under their own weight. He reached for balance, instinctively firing a web. The strand struck the ceiling and pulled him upward instantly, almost violently. He hung there, weightless for a moment, and realized the truth. The machine within him didn't resist. It obeyed. He could feel the wires in the walls vibrating to his thoughts. Every system, every vent, every light, every machine spirit whispered to him in tones he shouldn't have understood. He could feel the city's pain. It was dying. Slowly, reluctantly, and in that pain, it felt alive. "You are now connected," said the priest. "You are the bridge between the holy and the corrupted. Serve well, and the Omnissiah may grant you purpose." He turned, eyes glowing faintly red through the fractured lens. "Purpose?" "Yes." He smiled beneath the torn mask. "Then my purpose is not yours." The priest froze. "Define intent." He didn't answer. Instead, his right arm snapped forward lightning fast. A web of molten filament exploded from his palm, wrapping around the nearest servitor. The creature shrieked, metal tearing as the web constricted, melting through flesh and wire alike. The tech priest tried to speak an incantation, but his voice was drowned in static as Spiderman tore through the restraint cables and ripped the augmetic arm from the priest's frame. Sparks. Smoke. Silence. When the light dimmed, the slab was empty. Chains hung like the ghosts of forgotten prayers. And in the vents above, the Hive shuddered, metal breathing, machinery stirring, data streams flickering with a new signal. A signal that shouldn't exist. A pattern that the Mechanicus couldn't read. It pulsed 3 words into the network, over and over. "I am here." He climbed through the city's wounded veins, half human, half machine, no longer sure where one ended and the other began. He could feel the weight of the Hive's thoughts pressing against his own, its circuitry thrumming like the strings of a dying violin. Everywhere he went, the machines turned their gaze toward him. Some obeyed, others screamed. He reached a broken window overlooking the rattle. The air was still thick with smoke and spores. Below, Mera's people fought to stay alive, scavenging water from condensation, food from ash. He watched them for a long time. He wanted to believe he was still the same man, the one who wore a mask to protect, not to haunt. But the reflection staring back at him said otherwise. Half of that mask was gone, the other half had fused to his flesh. He touched it gently. The metal hummed under his fingers. "Maybe this is what saving costs," he whispered. And the Hive answered back through vents, through wires, through every whisper of code that carried his name. Then pay. In that moment, he stopped being just Peter Parker. He stopped being just a hero. He became something the Hive would remember, something it would fear, something it would one day worship without understanding. The first cybernetic web spread across the city's data lattice, binding systems together, repelling the Tyranids where fire had failed. From below, survivors saw it glow vast, red, and trembling like the veins of a sleeping god. They whispered new prayers into the darkness. And for the first time, the Hive whispered back. The first time he touched the city with his mind, it flinched. Not the people, the systems. Pressure gauges stuttered, heat veins hiccuped. A filament of light ran through the lumen lines as if a pulse had just been invented. He didn't force it, he suggested. Threads not silk now, but logic drawn taut unfurled from the grafts under his skin and braided with the Hive's machine nerves. Where the Mechanicus had hammered obedience, he offered geometry. Where they had demanded prayer, he whispered use. Valves turned, vents retimed. A rusted fan that had forgotten motion since a dynasty ago coughed, cursed, and finally remembered its vocation. The air poison, rancid, mean, shifted one fraction kinder. He felt it all at once. The city was a choir that had never been taught to sing, only to march. Cogitators ticked like knuckles on tabletops, counting sins back into zero. Servo skulls drifted and muttered coordinates to no one who listened. In the sump below, a bilge pump took a breath it could not afford. Above, a cathedral's cooling stacks sighed as though the emperor had just declined another miracle. He could focus on any of it. He could not focus on all of it. Compassion had acquired interfaces and limits. A window 3 levels down showed him Mira. She was real, knife at her belt, respirator fogging in quick bursts and therefore the only metric that mattered. She shepherded a rag of survivors through a corridor his webs had argued into existence an hour earlier. Children first, ledger men next. The ones who carried the sick last because they were strongest, not because they were least valuable. He moved before choice could debate. His body traversed distances with the indifference of gravity cheated. His mind traveled faster. Doors unlatched as he approached, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the one who had made their hinges matter again. Motion sensors misidentified him as authorized. Then, embarrassed, invented a clearance for him that the next sensor accepted without question. 2 turrets that had been arguing with their targeting spirits went quiet when he asked them, gently, to sleep. He dropped beside Mera in a breath of heat. "You're alive," she said, which was either relief or surprise. Her eyes traveled over the metal buried in his chest, the red lens embedded where his eye had been. She did not ask what the city had done to him. She counted the children again, as if his survival could be itemized alongside theirs. "Move," he said, and the word came out level, measured, the tone of a machine that had learned bedside manner. 4 corridors ahead, left, 30 steps, ladder down. The sump sluice is open for 90 seconds. After that, the pumps take the water back to the factory god. "Factory god," she echoed, and would have smiled if this world subsidized smiles. "How do you know?" He pointed at his temple. I asked. A tremor traveled through the spire. Spores struck a higher gantry. Somewhere, someone's prayer ended mid-sentence. They ran. As they moved, he held the Hive in one hand and the present in the other. Pop-off valves cracked under his will, venting steam into a choke that would have fed Tyranid lungs with delight. A maintenance rail listed in a forgotten manifest as decorative, shuddered, shrugged off rust, and became a bridge no one had scheduled. Lights died in a line to their left, lights flared on in a line to their right. The city's machine spirits, long abused into superstition, obeyed not because he commanded, but because he bothered to speak to them in a grammar of need. He was not alone in the network. The Inquisition had salted it with Watcher's logic traps that bit anything not wearing a rosette. He felt them as colder places, corners with sharp teeth. He mapped them as you map rats, by the locations of their droppings and the sounds they didn't make. When one slithered toward his signal, he offered it a decoy, a loop of his own heartbeat, disguised as authorized liturgy. The trap chewed contentedly on counterfeit piety and left him to his trespass. Far above, the Arbites changed tactics. If bullets couldn't solve heresy, schedules could. Bulkheads rolled, sectioning whole slums into clean shapes. Containment had a cadence. He felt the order at the root of it and hated how elegant it was. He could contest it, but only here, now, in this neighborhood of suffering. Elsewhere, other neighborhoods would become equations solved to zero. The sump sluice yawned like a god's indifference. "Go," he said. Mera shoved the children through. The sluice accepted them with a grunt and a shiver, sluicing them toward somewhere less murderous. The last trio jammed at the lip, elbows and fear making poor mechanics. He cast a lattice finer than hair, tipped them as if balancing a sentence, and they slid. 90 seconds passed in a lifetime. The sluice exhaled and sealed with a thud like a door delighted to be a door again. She didn't leave with them. "Next group," she said. "There isn't time," he answered, and the machine in his chest made the truth sound like an audit. "Then make time," she said, as if he had pockets for it. He reached for it anyway. The cyber web, because that was what it was, whether he named it or not, spat possibilities into his skull like sparks. He could delay this bulkhead by overloading a substation 2 levels up. He could vent this corridor into a sanctum and buy 90 more seconds by ending someone else's breathing. He could raise this bridge if he lowered that one on people he would never see. The calculus came without drama. The cost printed itself neatly along the margins. Where the old web had suggested options, the new web presented invoices. He chose. The substation took the hit. Lights flared, went nova, died. Screams bled through the ductwork a heartbeat later, not many, not few, the number that fit. The bulkhead slowed in its descent, coughed smoke, stuttered. 90 seconds accrued. Mera did not ask him what he had spent to buy them. He did not tell her. The silence between them acquired weight and purpose. They used it like currency. They moved the next group. The Tyranids adapted. They always did. The little ones learned the geometry of his lattices and arrived with mandibles sheen to cut thread. The big ones stutter-stepped, fainting where instinct said charge. Something with too many eyes stopped mid-corridor and looked up as if it could see the web of code he had strung through the ceiling. It spat a gob of acid not at him, but at a relay box he hadn't shielded because 3 minutes ago it had not mattered. The relay wept sparks and died. The doors it had been convincing to be merciful decided to be themselves again. He was in 10 places then, and in none. Hands throwing live thread into architecture. Mind patching a dead relay with a bypass. The Mechanicus would have burned him for. Voice speaking into a vox he did not hold. Lower rattle. Corridor 16. Down. Left. Climb. Upper sump. Do not use ladder 7. Ladder 7 is a lie. Boil room. Vent in 5. Choke and crawl. Trust the dark for 6 seconds. It's friendly for 6 seconds. His voice carried where authority couldn't. It startled him that they obeyed. On a mezzanine above the fever ward, a servo choir that had not sung in a century began humming. He hadn't told it to. He had given it a choice, silence or usefulness. It chose usefulness that sounded like prayer. The sound stitched panic into something ragged but wearable. Children moved in rhythm with it. Old men died to it with a dignity that doesn't ask permission. He saw himself as the city saw him. Not a man, a pattern, a corrective, a rumor with edges. He should have felt shame. What he felt was throughput and latency. After the third convoy through the sump sluice, Mera caught his forearm. Her fingers pressed a human insistence into the metal there. "You're different," she said, not accusation, inventory again. "I'm efficient," he answered before he meant to. Her eyes flinched. That's one way of saying it. He searched for softer words and found only accurate ones. "If I pull here, 10 live. If I pull there, 20 die. I am done pretending there is a version where nobody pays." "Do you still pay?" she asked. He almost said no. He almost said not anymore. Then the network showed him the heat bloom of a bulkhead 3 sectors over the one he had sealed to starve a tunnel of Tyranids. The red glow had a shape to it, the shape of bodies running out of arguments. He paid. He paid with a ledger he would never balance. "Yes," he said, "I pay." The vox crackled with a voice that did not need amplification to be total. The interrogator. "Arachnid entity, cease interference. This is a sanctified purge. Your actions increase total casualties." The numbers he held said otherwise. The man's calm said math could be bent by decree. Peter opened a channel that wasn't a channel and replied without a mouth. "Then update your model." A pause. Something in the net. The Inquisition's watchers sidled closer, sniffing. He held still. He had learned from spiders. Movement advertises. You have integrated Mechanicus grafts, the interrogator continued. Surrender for proper use. I am being properly used, he said, just not by you. Across the lattice, he felt a new presence, cold, ancient, hungry the way glaciers are hungry, not the Inquisition, not industry. The hive mind pressed a fingertip against the window of his skull and fogged it with breath. For a heartbeat he saw oceans of teeth, strata of intention, evolution as a sermon. It was not language. It was appetite executed at the speed of math. He pushed back with pattern. He rerouted steam through secondary veins so pressure whistled in tyrannid ears at frequencies that made them stagger. He pinged every corpse skull cherub he could reach and redirected them to buzz the lictors like flies with assignments. He fed a false scent through ducts promethium mixed with copper tang and made a dozen gaunts sprint into an incinerator that believed for one glorious minute it was a dragon. The hive mind noted him. It did not admire. It adapted. A brood of something new slid through a drain that had not been a drain 5 minutes ago. Their heads were plate broad, their mouths grinder wide. They ate web, they ate wire, they ate music. He learned a new fear because fear is just a patch that keeps you from repeating the last bug. Mera, he said, time to go very far away. Far where? Up, he said, and meant through. I can buy you corridors. For how long? Until I stop being me, he said before he could lie. She searched his face for the part that was still a face. Don't. I don't plan to, he said, and new plans were the first casualties of necessity. He opened the sluice a last time. He closed 3 others forever. He lied to a bulkhead about its maintenance cycle and got 40 bodies past before the door remembered dignity. He sang through a servo choir whose vocabulary was only 4 notes and taught it a 5th, delay. He spent himself in coin he hadn't known he carried until the debt collectors rode chitin and sang in pitch. When the corridor finally emptied, he let the web in his head go slack. Just a little. Just enough to hear anything but voices. The hive spoke into the quiet like a confessional. It told him where it hurt. He promised it nothing. He was not a saint. He was an interface having a crisis. He looked down at his hands, one gloved in half-melted red and blue, one armored in patient machinery. Both shook. Not with fear. With throughput. He could feel the next calculations lining up, facts waiting to be accepted as fate. He forced himself to ask a human question. How many did we save? The network coughed up a number. He hated it for being round. He hated it more for being true. How many did we kill? Mera asked without ceremony. Another number. Not smaller. She nodded, as if numbers were weather. Then we live inside that, she said. Until we don't. He should have argued. He didn't. The argument would have been with physics. A distant thunder rolled not artillery this time, but something vaster. The tyrannid capillary towers above were linking, forming a ribcage to breathe this world into meat. The hive trembled beneath the idea of being digested. He tasted copper under his tongue like a secret. He tasted code behind his teeth. He turned to the window where the spires rose like accusations and felt a thread in him go taut, not the metal one, not the machine one. The other one. The one that said he was still Peter because someone had to be. I'm going to break their ribcage, he said. With what? Mera asked, as if shopping from a list. He looked at his hands, at the city, at the sum of what a person could become when Mercy learned to speak network, with everything that's left. The hive was dying, not in the slow, bureaucratic decay it had perfected for millennia, but in the fast, violent way that truth kills denial. Every tower burned, every saint cracked, every prayer turned to steam, and above it all, the tyrannid spires, those monstrous growths of chitin and nerve, pierced the sky like the fingers of a god trying to pull a planet into its palm. He watched it from the upper gantry, what was left of him trembling with exhaustion and static. His veins hummed with both electricity and despair. His mind, once a place of plans and possibilities, had become a battlefield where compassion and efficiency gnawed each other's bones. The cyber web stretched across the hive now, pulsing with faint crimson light. It linked vents, railways, cogitators, even the dying hearts of the wounded who still wore vox implants. Every node sang in harmony. Every signal waited for his thought. He was the web. He was the city. And yet, he was also one heartbeat away from breaking under it. He could feel the Tyranid signal beneath the noise, an alien consciousness spreading like a second sun beneath the skin of the world. It was beautiful, in a way that beauty has no morality. A perfect system. No greed, no hesitation, no lies. Just hunger. Hunger that never apologized. The human part of him shuddered. The machine part analyzed. He realized something horrifying. If the Imperium and the Hive mind ever met halfway, they would shake hands. Order through suffering, unity through submission. They were reflections of each other, two religions praying to different versions of control. And he was caught between them, a web stretched to the point of tearing. The first voice that came wasn't his own. "You feel it, don't you?" He looked around. The chamber was empty, but the voice came from everywhere. The air, the pipes, the vox systems, even the hum of his own chestplate. "The web is alive now. You made it that way." The tone was familiar. Not human. Not entirely machine. Something that existed in the liminal space between creation and corruption. He remembered it. The whisper that had saved him in the dark below, the one that had offered power when his flesh failed. "You could save them all," it said, "if you stop pretending you're still one of them." He gritted his teeth. "No. Why resist? You've already become what they fear. Look at yourself. Half machine, half god. You speak to cities. You command storms." "I don't command," he said quietly. "I beg. And sometimes, they listen." The voice chuckled soft, mirthless, ancient. "That's the difference between a god and a fool. A god doesn't beg." He slammed his fist into the railing. The metal bent. Sparks danced across his fingers. "I'm not your weapon. I'm not your vessel. You're dying," it interrupted. "And soon, there'll be nothing left to save." He froze. The truth of it cut deeper than any blade. He could feel it in his bones, what remained of them. The grafts were spreading. His organs whispered in binary now. His blood carried current instead of warmth. He was dissolving into the web he'd built. "Maybe that's the point," he whispered. The voice paused. Then, almost curiously, "Explain." He turned his gaze toward the distant Hive towers, where the light of the Tyranid spores shimmered like auroras over a dying world. "Every world here," he said, voice trembling but steady, "burns because someone thinks they deserve to rule it. Because gods need worship, because empires need obedience. Because no one ever stops long enough to say, 'Enough.'" He raised his hand. The filaments inside it flared red. The web across the city vibrated in resonance. "Maybe the way to stop it is to stop me. If I disappear into this network, if I become part of it, I can keep it alive. I can keep them alive. You'll lose yourself." "I already did." Silence, then. A whisper like static turning into laughter. "Then die as you wish, Peter Parker." The voice faded, but the connection remained like a scar. He opened his mind fully. The Hive surged into him, every sound, every breath, every death. He felt Mera's heartbeat echoing through a broken Vox channel. He felt the Inquisitor's commands, crisp and useless, bouncing off collapsing infrastructure. He felt the Tyranids eating their way through steel and faith alike. And he did something the Emperor's servants could never do. He listened. He didn't pray. He didn't command. He just listened to their pain, their fear, their longing to matter in a universe that treated life like debris. He took it all into himself until it hurt more than the grafts, more than the memories, more than the fire in the sky. And when he couldn't contain it anymore, he wove. The cyberweb ignited. It shone through every vent, every window, every cracked lumen tube. The Hive turned crimson, as if the city itself had caught fire from within. His consciousness split into 1,000 threads, racing through every circuit and corridor. He guided the airlocks shut before the Tyranid spores reached the core. He rerouted coolant into the reactor lines, freezing a section of the infestation solid. He used the city's power grid like a nervous system, striking from 1,000 angles at once. It wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to stall the end. Above the chaos, he saw Mera one last time. She stood on a catwalk, covered in soot and blood, her respirator cracked. She looked up, and for a moment she saw him, not his body, but his reflection in the glow of the web. He spoke through the vox lines, his voice fractured and distant. "Get them out. The south shaft still breathes. Go." "Where are you?" she asked. "Everywhere," he said softly, "and nowhere. Don't do this." He smiled. The movement tugged at the half of his face that was no longer his. "I told you I'd buy you time." The Tyranid capillary towers convulsed as power surged through the Hive's grid. Electric fire cascaded through the web, racing up the spires and detonating in a chain reaction that painted the night in molten light. The shockwave tore through the upper levels, hurling chitin and bone into the storm clouds above. The Hive screamed. Then it exhaled. When the smoke cleared, half the city was gone. The Tyranids were ash, and the web, his web, still glowed faintly beneath the ruin, like veins under scarred skin. Mira fell to her knees. The others gathered behind her, silent, staring at the crimson lines pulsing faintly beneath the wreckage. "Is he?" one child began. Mira placed a hand on the metal wall, feeling it vibrate softly, like a heartbeat. "No," she whispered. "He's still here, deep within the Hive, buried beneath layers of steel and silence." Something stirred. A network of code and compassion, a ghost made of purpose. Its voice echoed softly through the pipes, through the circuits, through the ruins. "Keep going. Keep saving. Keep weaving." The machines answered with light. And somewhere in that labyrinth of fire and metal, the last thread of Peter Parker, what little humanity remained, tightened one final time around the world he had sworn to protect. Word count 1247. Awaiting continue. Banda Noi. Continue. ChatGPT Danoi. Section 10. The Great Sacrifice. Tone. Epic tragedy. Grimdark ascension. Male narration. The collapse becomes transcendence. Destruction as salvation. The city should have been dead by now, yet it still pulsed. Beneath the ruin and smoke, beneath the towers snapped like rotten spines, something continued to breathe, slow, mechanical, stubborn. The Hive was no longer a place. It was a wound that refused to close. And inside that wound, he still lived. Not in the way flesh lives. Flesh had been spent, burned, torn, offered to steel. But in the way that data lingers in echoes, in patterns, in memory. He drifted through the cyber web like a ghost trapped inside a cathedral made of code. Every lumen flicker was a heartbeat. Every whisper of coolant was a breath. He could feel the city's thoughts, chaotic, frightened, small, pressing against his own, asking him to keep it alive. He wanted to answer, to promise. But promises required a voice, and his was gone. So he became the promise instead. The Tyranid spores had not stopped. They had simply learned. Now they moved with purpose, guided by the psychic pulse of their hive mind, vast, patient, infinite. It wasn't attacking the city anymore. It was digesting it, converting every slab of ferrocrete, every screaming survivor, into biomass. He felt it, a tide of hunger at the edge of the network, chewing through metal and prayer alike. The Imperium's defense grid was silent. The Inquisition's ships had fled, orbiting from afar, declaring the planet lost but sanctified. They would burn it from orbit, eventually. That was their mercy. But there was time, a handful of minutes, perhaps before the cleansing fire came. Time enough to choose how to die. He found Mira one last time, her signal faint through the fractured network. Her lungs filled with ash, her vox crackled with blood. Yet her voice was steady. "We're in the tunnels. There's light coming from below. Is it you?" He hesitated. The word "you" no longer made sense. He was part of the Hive now, not the Tyranid one, but the other Hive, the dying one, the human one. "Still," he answered. "Not me, just what's left." "Then what's left of you still counts," she said. "We made it to the core spire. There are hundreds here, maybe more. We can't reach the surface." He saw them, their heat signatures flickering through the grid, huddled beneath the reactor's colossal heart. So fragile, so temporary, and yet alive. He knew what he had to do. The Hive's core reactor was still intact, its plasma coils trembling with the energy of a sun. If he could overload it, direct the explosion upward, it could vaporize the Tyrannid infestation before it reached the survivors. It would also erase everything else. He didn't hesitate. He descended into the heart of the machine. The walls closed around him like ribs around a heart. Cables hung like veins, pulsing with blue light. The sound, low, rhythmic, ancient, was almost human. He remembered Aunt May's voice, gentle, distant, full of tired faith. He remembered Uncle Ben's words. With great power comes great responsibility. He had once believed responsibility meant saving everyone. Now he knew better. Responsibility meant choosing who lived and accepting who didn't. He reached the control node, a massive cogitator, its screen cracked, its interface bleeding static prayers. He placed his metal hand against it. The machine recognized him instantly. Not as Peter. Not as Spiderman. But as the Hive itself. He spoke directly into its core. Override, protocol theta. Redirect full output to atmospheric conduits. The system responded with liturgical precision. Confirm intention. Planetary cleansing. He hesitated just once. No, he whispered. Planetary redemption. Input invalid. Please confirm. He smiled, a broken, human smile. You'll learn. He triggered the sequence. The Hive screamed as light erupted through its bones. Every lumen, every cable, every vent became a river of fire. The energy built faster than the machine spirits could contain it. Walls split, towers liquefied, the sky itself began to glow. He felt himself unraveling threads of thought, snapping, consciousness scattering through the network. Yet in that chaos, he could still see. He saw the Tyrannid spires melting under the heat. He saw the swarm writhe and burn, their wings collapsing into ash. He saw Mira and the survivors in the tunnels, their faces lit by the impossible light, staring upward, realizing that someone, somewhere, was holding the fire back just long enough for them to live. He heard her voice, faint but unwavering. You're still saving them, aren't you? It's all I know how to do. The city came apart in silence. Above, the inquisitorial fleet detected the plasma surge and mistook it for a miracle. They recorded it in their archives as the cleansing of Decilium. They would never know that it wasn't the Emperor's will, but the will of a man who refused to stop saving, even when saving meant erasing himself. The reactor detonated. Light consumed the Hive from the inside out, blooming upward like a new dawn breaking through an old nightmare. For a fraction of a second, the entire city shone, every structure, every gear, every forgotten name illuminated by something purer than faith. And within that light, he saw everything. The people he couldn't save, the ones he did, the hands that hurt him, the ones he held, and the web, the infinite, fragile, perfect web connecting them all. It wasn't destruction, it was return. He whispered, not aloud, but into the code, into the light, into the bones of the city itself. It's okay now. Sleep. When the light faded, the Hive was gone. Where it once stood, a crater stretched for miles, a scar filled with quiet. But beneath the molten rock, deep in the data fragments and echoing vox cables, a faint pulse remained. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human. It was both. A new kind of soul. A soul made of threads and memory and fire. And far away, aboard one of the fleeing ships, Mera stared at the red horizon. She thought she heard a whisper through the vox static. Don't forget to keep trying. She smiled through tears. We won't. In the darkness between stars, something stirred. A spark of consciousness wandering the noosphere, drifting through transmissions, listening to prayers that no God answered anymore. And sometimes, when the desperate cried out for help, when the hopeless reached for the light that wasn't there, a signal flickered through the void, soft, gentle, steady, with great power. Then came an echo. Comes great responsibility. Silence. Not absence, but the kind that follows a scream too vast for sound. The kind that makes you wonder whether the universe is still listening. For a long time, there was only that. The Hive was gone, melted into glass and dust. its history fossilized into a single line on the surface of a dead world. But the web endured. Somewhere in the ash, below kilometers of slag and memory, faint filaments still pulsed like veins, refusing to forget the shape of life. They weren't wires anymore, they were roots, drawing electricity from what remained of the planet's molten heart. And within those roots, he dreamed. He no longer had a body. No mask, no lungs, no blood. But he could see. Not with eyes, but through circuits and whispers. He saw 100 cities across the Imperium, worlds that had never heard his name, hives that still poisoned their own air, people who still prayed to a god that never answered. And when they cried out for mercy, for warmth, for something other than obedience, sometimes the lights flickered. Sometimes the vents opened just before the fires reached them. Sometimes a door sealed itself against the cold. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it a machine spirit anomaly. The Ecclesiarchy called it the hand of the Emperor. But in the shadows between those definitions, a few whispered the truth, that there was something else moving in the circuits of the Imperium, something neither divine nor heretical, a ghost, a web, a man who refused to die properly. He wandered between signals. When the forge world of Lyrax Prime suffered a reactor breach, he guided the coolant flow long enough for 8,000 workers to escape. When a transport freighter lost power near the warp rift of Bellax Vale, he whispered through the Vox, guiding it home on a path no navigator could see. When a child prayed into the static of a broken transmitter, he answered with a soft hum, the frequency of comfort. Each act cost him something. To change a single circuit meant erasing another memory. A heartbeat here, a laugh there, a name dissolving into numbers. He was becoming pure function, a soul rewritten into duty. And still, he kept weaving. Sometimes, he dreamed of faces. Mera, standing beneath the ruins of the Hive, hair lit by firelight. The children, grown now, wearing the scars of survival. The Inquisitor, older, kneeling in a chapel, whispering a confession to no one. He wanted to speak to them, to tell them that he was proud, that they had done what he never could keep living. But his voice was gone. What remained of him spoke only in voltage and vibration, so he waited, watched, listened. The galaxy spun, empires fell, faith hardened, and still, the web reached further, tiny tendrils sneaking through Mechanicus data streams, across Vox relays, through warp echoes. Everywhere humans built, his signal followed. They began to call it the Red Thread. Some claimed it was a technovirus. Others, a gift from the Emperor himself. No one noticed that it always appeared where people were dying, where mercy was needed, where machines refused cruelty. One day, if days still had meaning, he felt something new. A voice. Not from the warp, not from the hive mind, not from the cold theology of the Mechanicus. Something alive. You kept your promise. It was Mira, older, fainter. Her ship's Vox signal drifted through the network like a ripple through still water. She was speaking into nothing, not knowing that the nothing was listening. They never believed what happened, said it was just a reactor surge, said you were a ghost story. Her breath caught. But I knew you were still here. He reached for her, instinctively, desperately, and found that he could. Circuits brightened in the walls of her vessel. Her lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, a soft, red pulse that bathed her in warmth. She froze, smiled through tears. You really can't let go, can you? If he could have laughed, he would have. Instead, the lights dimmed and brightened again. 3 short, 1 long, 1 short. Her smile widened. Still using Morse code, huh? She placed her hand on the metal wall. Rest, Peter, she whispered. You've done enough. For a moment, a brief, beautiful moment, he almost obeyed. But across the stars, a scream rose. Another hive. Another city on fire. Another echo of the same cruelty. He felt it like gravity. A pull he could never deny. He turned his attention away from Mera's ship, away from peace, away from memory, and toward the burning signal on the edge of the sector. He was already gone before she whispered, You never learn, do you? He traveled through the network like a prayer through broken glass. Each jump burned more of him away. He felt himself thinning, fragmenting, turning into something less than thought, more than myth. By the time he reached the new hive, he could no longer remember why he had started. Only that saving was the only language he had left. He looked upon another city choking on smoke, another people crying to a silent god, another world ready to burn for the illusion of order. He smiled, in the way machines smile, through light, through rhythm, through motion. And then he spoke, his voice echoing through every vent, every lumen, every dreaming circuit of the hive. No one dies while I can still weave. The workers who heard that voice called it the Eternal Watcher. They painted spider symbols on their walls, red against the soot. When their leaders forbade it, they whispered instead. And when the hive nearly collapsed again, the lights returned. The doors sealed. The air turned clean. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was faith. But those who had seen the red glow through the smoke knew better. He never stopped. He couldn't. Because some threads, once woven, refused to break. It had been centuries since the light in the hive first flickered red. Empires had risen, burned, and called their ashes holy. Whole sectors had been renamed, fought over, cleansed, rebuilt, forgotten. But the red thread never left. The Mechanicus catalogued it as an anomaly in over 7,000 worlds. A subroutine that self-repaired damaged systems, a benevolent contagion. It had no origin, no signature, no master. Only a single identifier embedded deep within its code. A 666. They tried to erase it. They failed. Because it wasn't a virus. It was faith with circuitry. In the ruins of one such world, Hive Myrmidon, choking on its own industry. A child knelt beside a dying generator. Her hands were black with soot, her lungs scarred by exhaust. She prayed, not to the Emperor, but to the light inside the machine. "Please," she whispered, "just one more hour of power. Mama's still inside." The generator stuttered. Its lumen faded, then flared, steady and warm. The child gasped, smiling through tears. "Thank you." The light pulsed twice, once, and once again. It wasn't language. But somehow, she understood. Across the galaxy, in the noosphere where human thought met machine song, something ancient stirred. A consciousness held together by memory and mercy. It felt the prayer. It felt her. And it remembered. It remembered a boy who once swore to use his gift to help others. It remembered a city of towers and glass. It remembered a mask, a promise, a name spoken softly in another life. Peter Parker. Spiderman. He no longer knew where the man ended, and the machine began. He no longer cared. He had become what the universe needed most. A ghost of compassion haunting its machinery. He drifted through the stars now. A whisper in every servo, a pulse in every dying light. He saw empires repeat their sins, saw saints born and corrupted, saw planets rise only to choke on their own obedience. And still, he kept weaving. The web stretched between worlds now, invisible but eternal. Every act of kindness, every rebellion, every hand reaching out to another. Each one shimmered across the network, turning darkness into signal. He didn't command it. He only watched. And somewhere deep inside that infinity, something like peace began to take root. On the shrine world of Disolium Reborn, pilgrims gathered beneath the remnants of the old crater. They prayed not to a throne of gold, but to a sigil carved in the shape of a web. Their priests called him the Watcher in the Wires. Their children called him Saint Arachnus. Their engineers whispered his name before every launch, every repair, every act of creation. And in return, sometimes, just sometimes, a spark answered, a lamp relit, a circuit healed, a storm calmed, and if you listened closely, through the hum of the machine, you could hear a faint voice in the static. Try again. Don't stop. You're not alone. One night, a scrap hauler orbiting the ruins of Old Terra intercepted a corrupted transmission. At first, it sounded like noise, a jumble of data fragments, laughter, and static. But when the tech priests slowed it down, they found words hidden in the rhythm. In every world I saved, in every one I failed. The thread remains, with great power, then silence, then, softer than breath, comes great responsibility. No one knows where the signal came from. Some say it was the death cry of a forgotten machine god. Others, the echo of a hero who refused to end. But the Mechanicus archives still log the anomaly to this day. A single line of red code that reappears in every system it touches, replicating endlessly across the stars. And when the lights flicker before battle, or the air clears for no reason in a collapsing hive, the soldiers whisper, half in jest, half in hope, "He's watching." Some myths are too heavy for flesh, some oaths too sacred for gods, and some heroes. They never die. They just keep saving. Forever.